Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity to thank Lila from our New York office, helping us here last week, making this a success program. Thank you, Lila. Hi, everyone. Shalom and welcome. Welcome back to those that were with us in the first two sessions with Avi Melamed. And welcome. I see some new faces to those that are joining us for the first time here today. We're extremely happy to see all of you. I think you all know me by now. Leah Garber, Senior VP at GCC Association and a Director of the Center for Israel Engagement, based here in Israel. Just a few sentences, mostly for those that are joining us today for the first time. The Israel Academy, which is basically a series of seminars and talks, was designed specifically for you, for GCC professionals. And it was put together after many conversations with GCC execs and other professionals. It was put together recognizing how complicated and nuanced the topic of Israel is now, since October 7, and only becoming more and more complicated and challenging. And our goal, our hope, we aspire to help you through the Academy gain a wider perspective, certainly, and I think you all agree, certainly wider than what your local media outlets offer. We are looking into what's happening with honest perspectives, using facts, using research, and allowing all the difficult questions also to be heard through this course with Avi and the few others that we're offering. I do have to say something before I turn this over to Avi, that every week here, we are marking 8 months since October 7th in a few days, 243 days today. But this week has been heated, especially, not only because the weather is crazy and, it's temperature are reaching record temperature, also because of the news from earlier this week about the murder in Gaza of Israeli hostages. And because we don't know what's happening with the deal to release the remaining hostages. Is the deal happening? Is it not happening? Under what terms and conditions? And because of the really burning nerve. I mean, there's nothing different to describe it. Israel's northern part is under fire, literally fire, massive fires, and rockets constantly, and it's only getting worse and worse. It's escalating as we speak. Dozens and dozens of rockets are being launched from Lebanon towards Israeli civilian targets every day. As I mentioned, massive fires are consuming forests. And for those of you who have been to Israel, it's the most beautiful part of the country. And by now, summertime, it should have been packed, not with army and soldiers, but with Israelis that are traveling and camping out there. Entire villages are abandoned. There's no one there. It's considered as war zone. And many of those villages, most of the homes were hit by those rockets and are completely destroyed and ruined. And thousands of Israeli families are still evacuated, basically refugees in their own homeland. Just a few minutes ago, literally a few minutes ago, there was a direct hit of a rocket that came from Lebanon on a Druze village. Druze are Israelis. They're not Muslims, but they're not Jewish. They have this secretive religion. Different time we'll talk about that. But this rocket hit directly a Druze village that is located a few miles from the border with Lebanon. And there is a massive number of people that were hit in a few cities. So as I said, heated week, heated times. And during Avi Melamed's 6-session course, he will gradually help us step by step understand how and why the current conflict developed. We will unpack together with the different layers that led us to the events that we are facing now. But to get to that point, we need to understand the background that preceded all of these various developments. So with that, Avi, I'm turning this over to you. And today we will talk about the rise of militant Islam. So we'll obviously, as we always do, leave some time towards the end for questions. So if you have some, just write them down and we'll open for questions in about 35 minutes. Thank you.
Session.
Avi,
Yeah. All right. I was just saying, Leah, thank you so much. We are now session number 3. Islam is the solution, the rise of militant Islam. Let us just remind ourselves a little bit, just very shortly, what we did in the previous 2 sessions. The opening session, we talked about the 3 major factors that shaped the story of the Middle East through history. We talked about the identity features of the people of the region, the tribal and ethnic and religious component of identity. We talked about the role of Islam, the role of Islam as the dominant religion of this region since the 7th century. And one of the things that we said in that context was that Islam, the third monotheistic religion following Christianity and following Judaism, in all those religions, monotheistic religions, there has been always a component of intolerance stemming from the fact that there has been a rich, dynamic, vibrant translation of the core beliefs of a faith. And that component has to do a lot with things that we are going to talk about today in our session as we are talking about the rise of militant Islam. As you may recall, in the previous session, we talked about the story of the struggle in the 20th century of the people of the Middle East over the whole issue of the national statehood identity. Reminding you the Turkish Ottoman Empire that ruled the Middle East for 600 years and more, since the late 1300, basically came to an end following WW1. And ever since then, we talked in the previous session about the power struggle between different camps in the Muslim and the Arab world vis-a-vis the whole thing that is called national statehood. And we reached to the point where basically we identify that the whole story of national statehood was a failure for different reasons. The inner political, ideological rivalries between the different sects, the inability to overcome sectarianism, the corruption, the rise to power of brutal dictators, and so on, leading towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century to the major burst of protest in the Arab world known as the Arab Spring. We talked about it. That was basically the concluding point of our previous discussion. And today we are talking about another significant component that featured the geostrategic landscape of the Middle East in the 20th century onwards. And this is the rise of militant Islam. Just as a reminder, Islam, as I said before, is the third monotheistic religion, appeared in the Arab Peninsula in the 7th century. Islam was born in the Arab civilization, even though today, as a fact, majority of the Muslims are not Arabs. They are not from the Arab Peninsula, they don't speak Arabic, but Islam was born in the Arab civilization. By the way, the name Islam, the meaning of the name is the total submersion, subordinance, submission of the individual to the concept of the rule of one God and only one God. In Islam, it is known as Allah, which basically means the God. And one other significant component about Islam is the fact that Islam, unlike Christianity, Islam is not dividing between state and religion. Islam is a comprehensive set of systems and codes that basically dictates the believer's life and the community life in every possible aspect of life. This is something very significant to bear in mind when we talk about Islam, and particularly in the context of the rise of militant Islam. So we talked about the fact that towards the end of the 19th century, the people of the region are introduced to the concept of national statehood, the whole issue of nationalism that was basically born in Europe. We talked about the fact that it was totally alien concept to the people of the Middle East. And right there has been an ongoing, evolving political, ideological, cultural, emotional debate and rivalries within the Muslim and the Arab world vis-a-vis this whole thing that is called the national state or the nationalism. Now, interesting enough, there were Islamic scholars in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that though resent some aspects of the concept of nationalism, mostly because of the fact that it was originated in the Christian Western civilization, nevertheless, those theologists, those thinkers that used to have also a very significant role as spiritual leaders, they didn't totally rule out or rejected the concept of nationalism. They didn't really rule out the concept of the Western thought beyond the whole issue of nationalism. In fact, they basically said Islam and Western codes, or some of the Western codes, can dwell together. But it was kind of like a little bit sort of like the exceptional, because the overwhelming dominant, I would say, atmosphere within Muslim circles vis-a-vis the whole issue of nationalism, the whole issue of Western ideals embedded within nationalism, the atmosphere was very resentful, not to say hostile and rejectful. And as you may remember, when we talked about the power struggle in the Arab world in the 20th century vis-a-vis the whole issue of national statehood, we talked about different camps that were involved in this power struggle. We talked about the pan-Arab camp, the Qawm. We talked about the nationalistic camp, the Wataniya. We talked about the Islamic camp, and we mentioned the most significant representative of that camp, the Muslim Brotherhood that was established in Egypt in 1928. Later on is going to become the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world. In every single Muslim state in the world, there is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you may recall, we talked about it, totally and utterly rejected the concept of national statehood. It vowed non-compromising rivalry, and not to say animosity to Western values. It actually views the West and the culture of the West, the Western civilization, as a threat to Islam, to the core idea of Islam, to the moral and societal fabric of Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood totally rejected the concept of national statehood and rather alternatively vowed the concept of caliphate, a global Islamic entity, empire, that is based upon the implementation of the Islamic religious codex, rather known as the Sharia law. And the Muslim Brotherhood, since its very beginning, had major two characteristics. It has kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde features. On the one hand, it was acting as an educating factor, preaching, spiritual guiding, hands-on in both social and economic initiatives, supporting orphans, supporting widows, providing summer camps to people who cannot afford it to their children, and on and on and on. This was a very significant component, and is a very significant component in the whole modus operandi of the Muslim Brotherhood, this hands-on involvement that provided the Muslim Brotherhood with a huge support across the board. But at the same time, there was also a not-so-pleasant aspect of the Muslim Brotherhood, a militant one, a violent one, if you wish, manifested in the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood from its early beginning had a secret arm, a military arm, that was supposed to be, in the end of the day, the force, the violent force that will enable Muslim Brotherhood to take over control and to become the leading political dominate power. So this is the story of the Muslim Brotherhood. that appeared in the late 1920s to address the challenges of the Muslim and the Arab world and totally rejecting Western values. The Muslim Brotherhood are not, and were not the only player around in the Islamic camp. There was another interesting player, and this is the Salafi camp. The word Salafi means what has been, what is rooted in the past. Salafi ideology argued that the dire situation of Islam stems from the fact that basically Muslims has deserted the pure early days Islam moral codes. And actually they said, look, if Islam wants to recover, because they say Islam is in a dire situation, if Islam wants to recover, we must go back to these early days Islam moral codes. It doesn't mean that people should go back riding camels and living in a tent. It means that people should really strictly apply in every aspect of their life what was perceived by Salafi movement and ideologists as the early day pure moral codes of Islam. In time, in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, the crises in the Arab and the Muslim world are deepening. So the message of the Salafis ideologies is kind of like more and more infiltrating to different levels of the society. Because people are saying, look, we are trying this pan-Arabism, which is a secular ideology. We try Wataniya, the nationalism, which is also a secular one. We try even the Muslim Brotherhood way, which is preaching and all those things, but it doesn't really solve the problem. In fact, the problems are getting more and more bigger, wider, and deepens. That background of the increasing crisis in the Arab and the Muslim world in the 20th century, encompassed with this growing power struggle within the Arab political, ideological, cultural systems vis-a-vis the whole issue of nationalism, basically provide the fertile ground for the next step in the evolution of the Salafi ideology. And as always, there is a person right there that basically marks that change. And that person is an Egyptian scholar named Said Qutb. Said Qutb was a senior member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and interesting enough, he lived towards the late 40s and teach in the United States of America. And this encounter with the American culture, very directly encounter, was enormously impactful on Said Qutb, but not in the way that you may think. It actually caused a totally radicalization of his ideology and a totally animosity towards everything that the Western stands for. Said Qutb is actually the proclaimer of the radicalization within Islamic thought in the second part of the 20th century that later on is going to result some very significant phenomena. Qutb basically solidified his whole ideas around a couple of major components, ideas, so to speaking. He was talking about the Muslim world, saying the Muslim world is in a state of jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is a term in Arabic that actually refers to the times in the Arab Peninsula before the emergence of Islam, before the 7th century. Islam presents this time in a kind of like dark matters, as a time of ignorance, primitive people, allegedly. But that was totally not the reality. Before Islam, there used to be flourishing kingdoms across the Middle East and in the Arab Peninsula. Just the same, Qutb is describing Islam in a situation of a jahiliyyah. He argues that actually the Muslims have two major choices to make. Either to continue to be in the darkness of jahiliyyah or to really accept fully the concept of Islam, the total submission to Allah's rule on this world and the world after. As you can understand, he totally rejected Western values. He totally preached for the strict implementation of the Islamic religious law, the Sharia law. You can understand that he was very hostile towards Christians, towards Jews, in fact, towards anyone who thought was not really implementing Islam as it should be. Obviously, needless to say that he was, of course, vowing for the establishing of the caliphate, this global Islamic entity. Qutb himself was basically executed by the Egyptian authorities because at some point he has been viewed as a growing threat because of its radical preaching. And there was a very specific component in its radical preaching that was really kind of like poking the Egyptian government, resulting in the end of the day, the execution of Qutb. And that is the concept that Qutb argued that it is legitimate, if not imperative, on Muslims to oust, to overthrow Muslims and rulers or governments if they are not really applying Islamic religious law as it should be applied. This is something very significant because one of the concepts within Islam basically says, it's called in Arabic al-ta'a, which means the obedience. And that concept says to the clergy people in Islam, said, in the end of the day, you have to obey the rulers. The rulers may be corrupt, the ruler may be non-Muslim, the ruler may be vicious, but you have to obey the ruler. Qutb comes and says, no, not only that you don't have to obey the ruler, you have to eliminate the ruler if he is not implementing strictly the Islamic religious law. That was a very significant development in the Islamic thought, basically leading the foundation for the rise of what we called Salafi Jihadi Islam. You're probably aware of the term jihad. The word jihad in Arabic means an effort. In Islam, jihad originally referred to the efforts, the emotional, spiritual efforts that the very early Muslim believers had to apply in order to stick to their belief. Remember that in its very early days, Islam was under the run. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was under the run. His people, his tribe didn't really like his prophecies and his new message about Islam. And so Muhammad and his first followers were under the run, and they had to exercise their non-compromising commitment to the newly born religion, Islam. So that was the time where jihad was defined and looked at as an enormous emotional and spiritual effort. However, later on, very quickly, Islam became a conquering empire, mostly through a process of military rage and campaigns, which of course involved the death, the killing of people as part of these wars. And so jihad became more and more associated with the willingness and commitment of the Muslim believer to sacrifice, not only emotionally and culturally and psychologically and financially, but also to sacrifice, even if it means to sacrifice his or her own life, either in the service of spreading the message of Islam or defending Islam. The whole issue of jihad in Islam for itself is a fascinating issue that has many, many different components. Obviously, we can elaborate on that in many ways, but we can't do that today. But one of the things that I want to focus about is a specific element of this story of jihad, and this is the concept of the request of martyrdom. It's called in Arabic talab al-shahada. In Islam, martyrdom is very much praised, though it has a very strict clause about who is entitled to be considered as a martyr. It's a big story for itself. I wouldn't go into that. But one of the things that is very interesting with the involvement of the Salafi jihadi component was that they took this component of the willingness of Muslims, believers, to sacrifice even their own life, and they turned it from willingness to a request. It's not anymore about the fact that if I'm a Muslim and I'm a faithful believer, I'm also willing, if it calls for, I'm also willing to sacrifice my life. No, now it's about I'm a Muslim and I'm looking to sacrifice my life and to become a martyr. And this is called the request of martyrdom, talab shahada. You know, it's interesting, there is a phrase in Quran, the holy book of Bible, of the Muslims, and that phrase is saying, I'll say it in Arabic and translate, وَلَا تَحْسَبْنَ الَّذِينَ قُتِلَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Do not consider those who died for the glory of Allah dead. They are not dead. They are in Allah's hands, and He is taking care of all of their needs. This is a sentence that basically expresses condolences to people who lost their beloved one. There is in Israel a place, a memorial site in Israel for Egyptian soldiers that were killed in the wars with Israel. It is in Israel. It's a formal memorial site, out of respect, of course. Every year, the Egyptian embassy in Israel is holding a ceremony in this place, honoring the memory of the Egyptian soldiers killed in the wars. And this is the same phrase that is there in this memorial site. But it's there not as a sentence that basically encourage people to become martyrs, but basically in its true original meaning as a sentence that provides condolences to people who lost their beloved one. Militant Salafi jihadi Islamic ideology took that concept and actually made it something totally distorted, basically saying you should look to become a martyr. You should ask the title of martyrdom. And one other thing that basically Salafi jihadi Islam drew from Kutub ideology was the concept that is called takfir. In the Muslim traditional outlook, the world is divided to two kinds of people. There are Muslims, and there are those who are non-Muslims. They are infidels. They are, in Arabic, kuffar. They do not believe in the rule of Allah. Now, according to the traditional Islamic theologies, the purpose of Islam is, in the end of the day, to be the one and only religion on this earth where people will see the light and will become and will convert to Islam. However, some of those theologians says, look, some people will not become Muslims. Fine, they will remain Christians or Jews or whatever. They could live, of course, within this frame of global caliphate, but they will be a second-class citizens in this frame. Why? Because they are kuffar, they are infidels. Some of them can be convinced to become Muslim, persuaded to become Muslim, either gently or not gently, but some of them will not. The Salafi jihadi ideology took this concept of kuffar, the infidels, and actually made something very interesting out of that, and it goes back straight to one of the things that Qutb was talking about. Remember that Qutb was talking about the need to oust Muslim rulers if they do not implement strictly Islamic Sharia law. The Salafi jihadi ideology took that concept and basically said, look, it is imperative to take out Muslims rulers, even if they are Muslims. If it appears to be that they are not implementing the Islamic law, you have to do that because this is the rotten apple in the barrel. If you don't take out this rotten apple in the barrel, the whole barrel will go bad. Practically speaking, it means that the Salafi jihadist groups, organizations that you are familiar with, like, for example, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Jama'at al-Islamiyya, and other global jihad, basically took this concept of infidels and non-infidels and basically made it something where they label Muslims rulers a priori as infidels, as a fake Muslims, that they are even more dangerous than the infidels, the non-Muslims. Why they are more dangerous? Because they disguised as Muslims. And as long as they are in power, because they are Muslims and so they are legitimate, what happened is, according to the Islamic Salafi jihadi ideology, what happened is that they are basically spoiling the whole barrel of the apples, and therefore they have to be removed. That concept explains two major aspects that has to do with militant Salafi jihadi groups like ISIS, like Qaeda, like Global Jihad. One is the fact that they have a long list of enemies. Jews, Christians, the West, Israel, the Shiites, everyone. But on top of the list of their enemies, first and foremost, is to topple down the Muslim regimes and the governments of the Muslim world because they view them as fake Muslims. And the other feature that characterizes those groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Global Jihad, is the fact that because of that, their major portion of their victims are Muslims. Those organizations that has been operating since the beginning of the 70s in different forms and shapes, Al-Qaeda appeared in the late 1980s, ISIS appeared in the beginning of the 2000s, but there were other groups like Global Jihad, like Jama'at Islamiyah. They basically focus their militant activism first and foremost on their own environment, targeting their own brothers and sisters. Overwhelmingly, the enormous number of Muslims that were killed during the last couple of decades by those groups, they were killed by those groups. They have become the major target of these radical groups. So to conclude our session today, militant Islam appeared in the 20th century, particularly the second part, and it's the product of three main factors. One is the fundamentalist thinking which existed in Islam throughout history. Again, reminding you that radical thinking is not exclusive only to Islam. It also existed in Christianity. It also existed in Judaism. But it was significant in the context of Islam because Islam became the major structure frame of the region since the 7th century. The second thing is the direct encounter with the West that revealed the inferiority of the Islamic world basically was a major component fueling those feelings of anger, inferiority, frustration in the white circles in the Muslim world, labeling the West as their enemy and to a large extent as their reason, so-called, for the dire situation of the Muslim world. And the third, of course, is the socio-political economic hardship in the Muslim world, the failure of the statehood, the neglectance, the environment of violence, corruption, lack of services, lack of an environment that encourages respectful dialogue, an environment that contains different perspectives. The lack of such an environment was also another major issue that in the end of the day fueled the rise of militant Islam in the second part of the 20th century. Militant Islam is here and it's here to stay. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to conclude my presentation. Just as a reminder, I said it in the previous session, in September 2024, we are going to move to the States. We will be in the States from September 24 until July 25. Our aim is to reach, as part of our strategic partnership with JCC Association, to much as possible JCC chapters We are starting right now with the whole process of registration and so on. And again, I urge you and encourage you to be in touch with Leah to discuss different aspects of that exciting endeavor and opportunity. Thank you so much, and I'm opening this session to your questions.
Thank you, Avi. Another fascinating and I have to say, shadowing not a very optimistic angle on our reality today, but thank you for that. Just one reference to Avi's last slide about their tour starting in September. Some of you already reached out to me asking about the tour and more information. So right now we're working out the details. I can share with you honestly that the details that we're working out are to reduce as much as possible the cost for you guys hosting Avi. We want to make sure that we could secure donors funding in addition to the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs funding in Israel. So that's why it's taking a little longer. But hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll send out something to all of you with all the details and the cost to host Avi, which you all know is fabulous. So with that, if you have any question, please, you know the drill, unmute yourself and use the raise the hand feature. Yes, Amanda. Then Julie.
Hi. I was wondering, are there any non-militant Salafi Islamists? And if so, is that more religious based? And if not, not.
Yeah, great question. Yes, the answer is yes. Actually, there are three branches of Salafi thought. One is the jihadi Salafi that I was talking about today in my presentation. The other one is the political Salafi, meaning those who are coming from the Salafi ideology and say, look, our way to try to impact and to make a difference is through political action, a legitimate one. Again, for itself, it's a very extreme ideology, but it's still contained within the legitimate lines of political game. For example, in Egypt, there is a coalition of Salafi movement. It's called An-Nur, which means the light. And they are acting along the line of like, we are coming from the Salafi ideology. We don't vote the Salafi jihadi concept, but we definitely vote the Salafi political action. And then there is another interesting branch of the Salafi ideology, which is the one that goes towards isolation. This is a branch that actually said, look, we don't want to be any part of this world. We want to isolate ourselves. Literally speaking, physically speaking. We want to isolate ourselves from the surrounding environment because we think that it's spoiling our fabric. It is challenging our core beliefs. We can't change the environment. We can't change the world. So we are isolating ourselves. In a way, it reminds a group of ultra-Orthodox, for example, Jews, Haredim, that basically are saying the Neture Karta, that basically are saying we are trying as much as possible to remain in our bubble and to minimize as much as possible our interaction with the surrounding environment. And by the way, interesting enough, there was a group of such Salafi isolationists that actually in Egypt who lived in caves because they really want physically to isolate themselves from the surrounding environment. By the way, one of the outcomes of that specific group was that the assassination of President Sadat came actually from that group, the Egyptian president in 1981. So yes, there are three different, roughly speaking, branches of the Salafi ideology.
Thank you, Amanda. Before we go to Julie, it's wonderful to see that you have very loyal students and they're also very persistent with their questions, like Amanda and Julie. So thank you for that, Julie.
Yes, I always have questions, but this the reading, the pre-session reading, you said something when you were talking about the Al-Hazimi branch. It says the Muslim Brotherhood accepts the narrative that Judaism and Christianity are legitimate monotheistic religions and thus deserve to be protected by Islam. How is that reconciled with everything else?
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, I was talking about Al-Hazimi when I was talking about the radicalization of radicalization. What do I mean by that? The Muslim Brotherhood, Islam, by the way, as I said, Islam recognized Judaism as and Christianity as monotheistic beliefs. Islam called both Jews and Muslims and Christians by the name the people of the book, meaning the people of the Bible. Islam recognized all the prophets, the Jewish and the Christian prophets, as legitimate prophets that were proceeding before Islam. So the Muslim Brotherhood, basically in that regard, is expressing tolerance towards Judaism and Islam. You mentioned Al-Hazimi. Al-Hazimi ideology, which appeared in the relatively couple of last years, named after a Saudi Salafi radical preacher. His name is Al-Hazimi. Al-Hazimi basically said the Muslim Brotherhood are too parv. They are vegetarians, quote unquote, in their approach to Islam, towards Judaism and Christianity. He said, no, we don't recognize the legitimacy of Judaism and Christianity as has been monotheistic religion. This is what his ideology. So that's the reason when I was talking about Al-Hazimi, and we talked about, and you mentioned, as an expression of the radicalization of radicalization. Another expression of this radicalization of radicalization is the fact that ISIS is the offspring of Al-Qaeda. ISIS was born in Al-Qaeda. Its early stage, it was part of Al-Qaeda. Today, as a fact, and for the last couple of years, the mother movement and the offspring are actually engaged in a battle, violent battle, one against the other over the crownship of Salafi jihadi world. So this is another manifestation of this escalation of escalation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Any other question or thought that you would like to share? Amanda, is it a, yeah.
It's a question. I did the reading before the session and didn't quite understand the concept of am I saying this right? Tamkin? And I was
Tamkin.
wondering, Tamkin, and I was wondering if you could explain it kind of short and easy.
Yes. Tamkin is a word in Arabic which means making it possible. Tamkin is a guiding concept in the Muslim Brotherhood thought, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood says, look, our mission is to make the conditions possible for hopefully one day to make this global caliphate. This is our job. We have to create the conditions to make it possible. Salafi jihadi concept is called takween, which means making it happen. Not making the possible circumstances and conditions, but making that happen. How do you make it happen? Through violence. So the concept of tamkin means making it possible through setting the circumstances and the ground for such development.
I'm so proud of, when people are saying we read the prep materials. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Any other question? Okay. Either it's all very, very clear or it's all too confusing. So unless we have any other question, I know that Avi is giving a talk to one of our JCCs right after our session today. So he's actually jumping from our Zoom to California, presenting there. It's nice how through this world, Avi could be at all places within a few minutes. I want to remind you all that next week is the holiday of Shavuot. So we will not be meeting next week. Our following meeting will be on June 19th. I know that for some GCCs, it may be a day off. I know that it is for GCC Association, Juneteenth. So if you're working, that's wonderful. And if it's your day off, I can't think of anything better to do on your day off than to join a class with Avi. So looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you, Avi. Thank you all for joining us. And let's hope for a better week ahead. Hello.
Shalom,
Thank you,
shalom.
Avi. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you. Shalom from Israel.
Appreciate you.